Hi everybody, welcome to the Top 2 Inches of Sport podcast with me, Anthony Sheriff. This is a podcast about something that's always fascinated me, the mindset required to succeed in elite level sport. On this podcast, I'm going to talk to people who I really look up to in the world of sport and try to find out how they deal with the highs and lows that come with consistently striving for success in the unforgiving environment of elite sport. For this episode of the podcast, it was a privilege to speak to one of the truly great MMA coaches of all time, Greg Jackson. Greg has coached some of the very best mixed martial artists of all time, with the likes of John Jones, George St-Pierre, Holly Holm, and many, many more, all working under Greg in the famous Jackson Wink MMA Academy in Albuquerque. Greg is a 3-time MMA Coach of the Year, so it was great to hear all about his approach to coaching and the mindset required to coach at such an elite level for such a long period of time. On a personal level, I've watched Greg's fighters on television for years and I've always been in awe of the performances that they put in on the biggest occasions possible. So to have the opportunity then to speak to Greg was genuinely a real privilege for me, and hopefully it's a chat that you'll enjoy listening to as well. So here's episode 31 of the Top 2 Inches of Sport with world-renowned MMA coach, Greg Jackson. Okay, and we're good to go. So I'm here with Greg Jackson. Greg, as I said in the introduction there, it's genuinely, for a fight fan like myself, it's a privilege to have someone like yourself on, somebody who's worked with some of the best fighters I've certainly ever seen and anyone has ever seen, really. So genuinely very, very grateful that you've taken the time. So thanks very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on, boss.
No problem. We will talk about your career as we've discussed off camera. So we're going to talk about how you work with fighters and your experience as a sports psychologist as well. But before we get into your actual career, can you just give us a bit of a background on yourself? So tell us a little bit about where you grew up, because if I'm right in saying this, I believe you were doing a bit of fighting on the street before the octagon. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. So I was born in Washington, D.C., but I was raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in a place called the South Valley of Albuquerque, New Mexico, a predominantly Hispanic community where a lot of kind of machismo rhetoric there. So, yeah, they didn't really care if you could do anything except fight. And so I figured, well, I better get good at fighting because I like self-respect. That's always nice. Or, not to not get beat up all the time. That's always nice too. So I started my journey very early, 5 years old on basically. So it was very interesting. My parents are pacifist Quakers. So I was raised in this part of this pacifist community, and then also obviously part of the martial arts community. So I kind of have a unique bridge into both worlds there. And growing up, it was necessity based. So I didn't watch like a Bruce Lee movie and then want to do martial arts. It was just pure necessity based for me. I'm not a very violent person. I fight when I have to, but I'm not an entertainer or anything like that. So that's kind of my life story. And then fast forward, here I am talking to you. The other thing that people might find interesting is I never wanted to be a coach. I just wanted to teach. My students talked me into the competitions in the early 90s, well, mid 90s, I guess, in the days with the no rules stuff. So we started there and I've been going ever since.
It's interesting that you said your parents were pacifist Quakers, so they're obviously dedicated to pacifism and non-violence. I find that interesting because, I've been lucky enough over the last few years to get to know some fighters, more so boxers than MMA fighters. But one thing that's always struck me is I think one of the biggest misconceptions out there from people that have never been in a MMA gym or a boxing gym is that fighters are big brutes who go around sort of angry. But from my own personal experience, the nicest gentlemen I've ever met and gentlewomen are fighters. There seems to be they seem to be very placid an awful lot of the time now. I'm not sure, maybe that comes from not feeling the need to prove themselves, but you've just said there you grew up around, very placid people. Do you think having those pacifist tendencies almost helped you when it came to actually dealing with the pressure of violent situations, that you were almost able to analyze it a bit cooler, if that makes sense?
Actually, that's a very good question, but I didn't feel that was my experience. I felt that what it did give me is an appreciation for the appropriateness of violence. Like, when is violence appropriate and when is it not? Like a very stark kind of picture of that. So the limitations of that pacifist ideology. In other words, it relies on other people coming to help. So like when Martin Luther King or Gandhi used it, they put pressure on a government that then had to, saw the horrors of it, and everybody kind of got behind them. And so things switched. Doesn't help you at all when nobody cares. And it is a very micro world. Now you can, trying to de-escalate situations, there's a lot of value and merit in that. Where I grew up, de-escalation just meant weakness. So they would view that as more reason to try to pick on you. So it has a time and a place and it has a context, but saying that one strategy is viable for every context is not true. I mean, you could not get social change with a violent revolution in a lot of places, and that's where nonviolent kind of strategies come in. And there are some personal nonviolent strategies. Again, it's a case-by-case basis. So it really taught me that. It taught me how to look at conflict, how to look at violence, and kind of how to treat it with the respect it deserves.
What was your first martial art that you got involved in then, aside from the street?
Yeah, well, I come from a long line of wrestlers, so technically wrestling was, but the first formal one I did was Aikido. My parents tried to put me in a quote unquote nonviolent martial art with Aikido. And Aikido has some decent stuff in it. You have to kind of data mine it a little bit, but most of it is not super, especially early on, not super applicable to a lot of combat situations that I was in.
Yeah. What would you say, actually, I know this isn't really sports psychology based, I'm just interested to hear about your background though. What would you say is the best martial art as a gateway into MMA, or is there a best? Can you kind of progress onto MMA from the vast majority?
Well, that's a very good question. So mentally, the best art for sure is wrestling, because it's just the grind and all that stuff, and the pace is very similar. And then boxing, kickboxing, any of those competitive combat sports are usually really good. Because the stuff they use has to have some kind of validation. You can't just be like, well, this might work. And that helps out a lot. So those are the baseline sports. The mentality of wrestlers, just the toughness of wrestlers, is usually paramount in as far as what I say. That's the first one you want to get involved in. Technically, jiu-jitsu or Muay Thai as well. You always have to remember that MMA is it is its own martial arts. People think, well, that just means that we use Muay Thai, but we have to do things just a little bit differently than Muay Thai, just a little bit differently than wrestling. You get caught in that trap a lot. You get kind of caught by, let's say Muay Thai is a great example. You catch legs and punch people in Muay Thai or sweep them down, and that all works extremely well. And we do that in MMA. Well, we could also just double leg, right? Where you can just either interrupt double leg or fly. So you have to understand there's constraints in the mixed martial arts. And if you do it exactly like that, it still works, but there might be a better or a different way to do things. So that's the fun part of. So there's great gateways, but eventually you have to modify everything into mixed martial arts paradigm.
Did you actually compete yourself, Greg, as a...
No, I was never, and that's the thing, is that I never wanted to be an entertainer. I never wanted to, have all that attention on me, fighting in front of people, like all that. When I was a kid, I was a bit of a show off, but I kind of went through my time on that, and it kind of came out the other side. And probably because of the background of my parents and stuff, and not seeking out violent fights, that was never me. So, I mean, they sought me out plenty, but I wasn't like looking for trouble, so to speak.
Yeah, so you got into coaching very early. Am I right in saying you opened your first MMA school or academy at 17 years of age? Is that correct?
Yeah, 1917, yeah.
1992. So then, like, again, I was born in 1989, so I don't remember UFC 1, because I believe UFC 1 was 93, I think. So that was, what, a year after you opened up your first fight academy. How would you say, like, the explosion of UFC, because again, I don't remember, but from what I've read on it and the videos I've watched back, apparently it was just this massive revelation, particularly with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that maybe that wasn't very well known prior to UFC 1. So how would you say the explosion of UFC influenced you, or maybe even changed the way that you taught fighting to your students?
Well, that's a great question. So the Gracies, and I always say this when I first started, seeing the Gracies, they were PhDs. They were a bunch of professors, and I was in kindergarten still. But we were doing a very primitive version of MMA, but nothing like on their level. So that was a big revelation, just seeing how effective it was at a higher level than I was at the time. And that was really cool. I was neat to see. There's been two in my experience, there's been two great shifts. That was one, because up until then, we were what I always call a victim of the 80s martial arts, where everybody would be like, bro, takes 3 pounds of pressure to break a knee. You know, like all these like ridiculous stories about like, yeah, it's just a bunch of theatrics. You know, ninjas and whatever else we were all into back then. And so that was a huge wake up call. Now, okay, well, let's actually fight. And then all of a sudden, the 2 pounds of pressure to drive the nose into the skull and kill a man. Well, no, that isn't exactly correct. You still see it today. You have like these science shows that are like, getting kicked by this fighter is being hit by a Mack truck. It's the same force. I'm like, I've been kicked by a lot of hard dudes, but I don't know if I've ever been hit by a truck and considered that to be the same amount of force. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. So yeah, you still get some of that stuff where it's like this mythological, over the top craziness. But so that was a big wake up call. And then in 2005, or 4, whatever year it was, The Ultimate Fighter, that the TV show, that changed things again. Then there was like another iteration of change after that.
Yeah. And who actually taught you Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu then? Because I read somewhere, I'm not sure, you can correct me if this isn't true, that you don't actually have a traditional belt ranking in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Not at all. Nobody ever taught me jiu-jitsu. I mean, they teach me moves. You know, somebody would be like, oh, look at this move. Or, you know, one of my guys would fly somewhere, train somewhere and come back. Hey, look at this move. But yeah, no, I had to figure it all out myself. And then in those days, we did a lot of grappling competitions. So then we would come with our moves and we did extremely well. But we'd still see things that we weren't sure about. So I'd remember them and then take them back and figure out how to get around them. And that's the fun of it. So it's always a laboratory to me, like the UFC or grappling or whatever is just a laboratory for your ideas. And so that's why I come at it. If my ideas work, then great. We get another victory. And if they don't work, well, we throw it out and on to the next.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you've said that, because from the very little I know about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I've never done it, but from what I understand and from listening to people at a high level speaking about it, they talk as though it's almost like high level problem solving. So the likes, if I watch it, I just see people rolling around kind of having a fight on the floor because I don't understand the technical side of it. But when you're looking at a fight like that, are you not looking at it the way I would, like just two people collide? Are you almost looking at it almost as an equation, like a maths equation or a geometry equation, where you're actually just trying to pit the strengths and weaknesses against each other and try to come up with answers to specific questions that have been posed?
Yes, but also structurally, where they're leaving, what angles they're leaving open, where they are, what attacks and counters those opportunities are afforded by their correct actions or mistakes or whatever you want to call it. So that you're constantly looking is really cool. At the beginning of mixed martial arts, everything was giant. You had first it was jiu-jitsu guys, then wrestlers figured out how to sprawl and brawl, and then kickboxers came and figured out how to stop the wrestling shot, or I'm sorry, they sprawled and brawled. And so you get these huge paradigm shifts, and now it's very small. Now it's like, okay, everybody gets an underhook on the left side there. So it's but they're very small. And if you don't know what you're looking at, you'll miss it. And that's reason enough to go do some jiu-jitsu and learn that stuff. But again, a lot of jiu-jitsu guys don't know. They just look like two guys swinging, if you're doing Muay Thai or boxing, just swinging at each other, and they don't understand how they're setting it up, the angles, the timing, the rhythm changes, all of these things that allow you to do those things. So it is really becomes more beautiful the more educated you are. Yeah.
No, I can imagine that, yeah. Just to move on then to, I suppose, the more sports psychology element of things then. You've worked in elite MMA now for such a long time. What would you say is the general opinion on sports psychology or towards sports psychologists from fighters, first and foremost, before I talk about yourself as a trainer? Would most fighters who are fighting at an elite level work with sports psychologists from your own experience?
Yeah, I deeply encourage them to, because the mind is just like a muscle. And if you have a trainer for it, it gets stronger and better. So yeah, I super encourage. I'm a big supporter of sports psychs. And I encourage all my guys, especially it gets harder, not easier as you get towards the top, right? You've got so much more pressure on you. And, there's everything, any win or loss gets amplified. So yeah, having a sports psych in to deal with all of that. It's not your preparation, your after, what you're experiencing during is super valuable. Yeah,
you obviously have a lot of fighters. Do you have a sports psychologist or maybe a couple of sports psychologists within your academy, or is the onus on the fighter to sort of go and source their own?
Both. We do have some guys that work here, but we have so many, you couldn't have one that did everybody. It'd be impossible. So yeah, they either suss it out themselves, or we have some here that they can use as well.
What about yourself then as a coach? Because obviously you're dealing with, it might not be the pressure of getting punched and kicked, but you're dealing with massive pressure yourself. I mean, the amount of thoughts that must be going through your head in the lead up to a fight, and particularly on fight night when you've got 1 minute to relay your thoughts to your fighter as well in between rounds. Do you yourself work with a sports psychologist, or have you in the past?
I have, but not for myself, just to ask questions about, what their methodologies are to help with fighters. I have a pretty easy job, you know what I mean? Like they punch and kick me outside the cage a lot, but once they're in there, it's just them. So I just need to stay in the process. And so I guess my sports psychology stuff, it would come from more on the Zen side. I'm really lucky to have one of my best friends is a Zen monk, and so he gives me advice and he's kind of my mentor, and helps out on that end of it. So just staying in the flow, staying in the process, keeping in mind that what's important, that kind of thing, it helps me out a lot. That certainly has helped me be successful. But it's not like I have a hard job where they're not trying to knock me unconscious. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. And what about then, just in terms of when you're actually training the fighter, when you're in training camp, do you view your role as just specifically tactical and technical, or would there be an element of your job being a psychological coach in a way as well? Would you discuss possibly, the anxieties that a fighter might be feeling in the lead up to a fight? Would you put a bit of that into your delivery as well?
Well, it depends on where I'm needed. So I'll do a ton of that, especially early on, teaching you how to grind, how to stay calm when you're running in the red, as far as your heart rate and stuff. Yeah, that kind of stuff, how to deal with pressure, how to deal with anxiety. Early on, I do a lot of that stuff. But then you might need more of a technical as you get better. You might have that down pretty well, or there's a sports psych that's better at it than I am. And so then I'll pass that off to the fighter, and then I work more on the technical side. But I'm a little bit of a generalist in that I have to do the kickboxing, the boxing, the wrestling, the jiu-jitsu, the ground and pound, and the sports psych, and some of the strength and conditioning. I have to have a knowledge of all of it so I can put it together for the fighter. That's very important.
Yeah. Is it something that you would talk about maybe on weigh-in day or fight day itself, or is it more just messages that you'd be relaying to them in camp, just so when they do get these feelings of anxiety and stress on fight day, it's not necessarily alien to them. They're prepared for it. They know it's coming, and therefore they can deal with it far better. Like, is it something that you would relate to them in camp?
Yeah, preparation on that and then I keep a couple of cards in my back pocket in case something goes sideways on there that I don't mention, but then I will pull that out if they're freaking out on weigh-ins or fight day or whatever, to keep them calm and focused. But yeah, preparation is the real key with that. So before they ever get there, they should know what to expect and what they're going to go through.
I'm always fascinated. I've heard of lots of boxers, and I'm sure MMA fighters are the same, as being like gym champions, so they're excellent in the gym, and then their coaches and their teammates will be quite surprised that their career didn't go in the way that they anticipated, because I suppose, again, it is that anxiety and that pressure that they don't quite perform, and the bright lights are on, the TV cameras are there. Have you experienced, you don't need to name names obviously, but have you experienced many fighters that have been excellent in the gym and then maybe just haven't really reached that same level on fight night? And also vice versa. Maybe you might have some fighters that are good in the gym but not great, but then on fight night you're thinking, Jesus, he's unbelievable.
I have many of those experiences, and it's actually even more subtle than that. You have, those are gym warriors. Then you have guys that will fight beautifully as long as there's no pressure on them. But if they fight for a world title or a big fight, then they can never handle that. And I've had a lot of failures, even giving it to others, to some sports psychs, or trying it myself, not being able to solve that problem in the thousands of fights that I've done. And then the other way around, like Clay Guida is a great example of the other way around. And Clay Guida would, he'd do good in the gym. He'd do all right. But sometimes a beginner would catch him and I'd be like, oh, my God. But then fight night would come and he's this whole other guy. He just loves it. He'd call me in the morning. It's game day, coach. And then just go out. And I mean, he beat Pettis. He beat Dos Anjos. I mean, he beat all of these guys that are just amazing fighters. And I would, every time I'd go, be like, oh, stressed out, you know what I mean? Because I love Clay. So how are we going to win this thing? And then he would just step up and kill him. So he's an example of a guy that is a performer for sure.
Yeah. So he obviously loves fight day. Can you talk me through your fight day? So from when you get up in the morning all the way up to when you're in the locker room beforehand and you walk to the octagon, how involved are you as a coach with your fighter on that day? Or is it a case of that obviously the physical work is obviously all done. So is it just a case of you relaying a few simple tactical and technical points to them? Or do you pretty much leave them be? Like, because you probably don't want to be swamping them with too much information so close to the fight. Do you just trust that the work has already been done? Or what would your fight day typically look like?
Well, it's completely different depending on the fighter. Every fighter needs something different. So sometimes I just let them be. I don't need to mess with them. I just chill out and relax. Sometimes we do shakeouts in the morning where that's what I like to do. Just get a little nerves out of you, just break a sweat and stretch a little bit, prepare your body for the fight that evening. Some fighters need to go over the game plan again one more time that morning, even though we've done it 10,000 times to that point, but just to, really just to get, back in there. And some don't want to think about it until they basically rest until it's time to go. So you have to learn who your fighter is. It's the old Sun Tzu maxim, right? Know yourself, know your enemy. So knowing yourself is knowing your fighter. And it's such a wildly diverse need psychologically that I've kind of adapted to, that there's not one formula that you just stamp for everybody. Man, if there was, I'd charge $1 billion for it and write a book.
Yeah. Do you enjoy fight day, or is it something that you maybe?
I do. I like the pressure. I like the competition. I like helping my friend get their dreams. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to beat that feeling when you see somebody that you care about with their hand raised and they're so happy, and that keeps you going for the next one.
Well, my favorite thing in terms of combat sport coaches is watching how they deal with fighters in between rounds, because obviously you've only got 1 minute and the fighter could be bust up, probably absolutely exhausted. So it's so interesting to see how they communicate with the fighter in that 1 minute. So obviously I'm from Ireland, so our most famous coach in MMA over here is John Kavanagh, who obviously coaches Conor McGregor and the SBG team. So I heard an interview with John before where he was saying he focuses on, it's either 2 points or 3 points. I can't quite remember. I think it's one thing that the fighter's doing well, one thing that they could improve on, or it might be two things they're doing well and one thing they could improve on. I can't quite remember, but he has a rule of thumb anyway, because obviously he just says you can't give 10 or 20 messages because the fighter's not in the frame of mind to be taking on all of that on board in such a short period of time. Do you have a rule of thumb in terms of delivering a message to a fighter that you stick by in terms of maybe the amount of points you want to go over?
Not so much the amount of points as the ability to receive any points. Yeah, John's absolutely right. You're not going to go over 15. You can't remember 15 things right now. How are you going to do that in a high stress situation? So my big thing is trying to get their breathing slowed down, try to get their heart rate down, hopefully under 140, so that they can begin to process things again that you're telling them. Because sometimes if they're too exhausted, you can tell them anything and they're just trying to get their air back. So get their air back, and then make sure that every coach has time. So I usually only talk maybe one thing, and then I make sure that each coach puts an input. So yeah, it's usually maybe three or four things, but hopefully one of them will stick. Either the one I'm saying or one of the other coaches will stay. And if they remember all of it, that's great. But it's a menu for me, and sometimes the one thing they need to go or to pick, that's usually what I do. So that way everybody that in the corner has a say and an idea. And again, you might be saying the same things, but for whatever reason, when the other guy says it, your fighter clicks. So that's the way I do it. Yeah.
And from when I've seen you coaching in the corner, you do seem to be pretty calm all of the time. Anytime I've seen you, you seem to be delivering your message very calmly. Are you very conscious of not just what you say, but how you say it, like that nonverbal communication? Because I've seen coaches in the past telling fighters to relax and stay calm, but they're shouting it at them quite aggressively. And, the nonverbal communication doesn't necessarily align with the verbal communication. So they're just sending mixed messages. So is it something that you, maybe you're just natural at it, or is it something that you actually pay conscious attention to, that nonverbal communication?
No, I'm very conscious about that for sure. Like staying calm, staying focused, staying relaxed, and attitude can be passed on like anything. It's our great friend Musashi says a lot of that. Like if you yawn, right, then it makes other people yawn. If you're calm, focused, and ready to win, then other people will be calm, focused, and ready to win. So yeah, passing that on is very important. Maybe even more important than what you're saying. Is your attitude in there, is that calm confidence that you need. Yeah. And one thing I've actually noticed
you doing in corners, and maybe you've spoke about this in the past, I'm not sure, but when you're talking to your fighter, I've noticed that you do use your full name quite a bit at the time. Like, so for example, if you're coaching Holly Holm, you might not just say, okay, Holly, this is what you need to do. You might be, okay, Holly Holm, this is what you need to do. I don't know, like, maybe I'm just a bit of a geek who likes like singling out these small little details in sport, but I'm always fascinated by little things like that because it's kind of unusual. I don't really see that with other coaches. Now, just from me observing that, it kind of takes me back to, I can sometimes think, I wonder, are you being like a school teacher trying to get the attention of a student? Yeah. Like, you know, like Greg Jackson, are you listening? Is that the Yep. thought process behind that?
You got it. So that I call it my dad doing my dad. That's actually my mom yell at me and get in trouble. But if my mom said, Gregory Thomas Jackson, get in here, I was like I would be in trouble, right? So I call it my dad voice. So if you hear their full name, that usually makes you pay attention. Because a lot of times you get caught in noise in the fight. You can not hear them. You can have auditory exclusion. You can hear some parts of it, whatever. But if I really need their attention, I usually use their first and last name. If they are in trouble, then I'll throw the middle name in. If I know it. So, and then sometimes I joke with them. Like I used to tell Cub Swanson a joke in between each round, just to get him calm and focused, because that would let him relax and be creative. That was his big deal, is to get him creative. So every fighter's different. Sometimes with my foreign fighters, I'll do a terrible foreign accent to make them giggle while coaching them. It depends on what they need or what I feel they need to perform their best. So you have to be very versatile, but also very organized in the corner.
Yeah. Obviously, it's such a dangerous sport as well. You know, like you'll have fighters come back to the corner and you're probably having to assess their physical condition as well. Like, they could be badly hurt. But one famous example, obviously, you probably know what I'm going to say now, that you're well known for, is GSP, George St-Pierre, when he came back. I think was that UFC 100? Maybe it was between.
I don't. Yeah, I think so. I don't remember which one.
Between rounds 3 and 4, and he had obviously popped his groin. And I think he said to you, "My groin is gone," and you just said, "Hit him with it," or hit him with his groin. So, like, as a coach, obviously, if he came back with a busted eye socket and maybe was at risk of going blind, you would have reacted differently. But are you like analyzing the level of injury and then just trying to flip their focus? So you straight away there probably took his attention away from worrying about his injured groin, straight onto refocus and just get aggressive. So are you constantly calculating in your head, winning, but also you are there to keep them safe as well?
Absolutely. And so, you have to balance it out, right? Because if a little bit of blood or a little busted broken bone or whatever, like, it depends. Like, Holly Holm has fought entire rounds with her arm completely broken in half. And she said, "Oh, my arm's busted." But her attitude was that she still wanted to fight. Sometimes fighters will be on the fence. If they still want to fight, it's very hard as a coach to go, "No, you're done." Yeah. Now, if you're taking an obscene amount of damage, okay, that's one thing. But being busted up, but some fighters will be like, and I'll see it in their eyes. They're like, "Oh, my jaw's broken." And I know they're super tough. I'll be like, "Yeah, that's it. I'll call it." So it really depends on the fighter's attitude, and I can tell how injured they are usually by their attitude or how they're going to do it. So that's a fine and dangerous line that you play as a coach, because you don't want to overreact to an injury because, it might get them hurt. Well, yeah, a lot of things will get them hurt in there, and they won't forgive you. Like, if I found out Holly's had a broken arm and she still wanted to fight, and I said, "No, you can't," and then they lose, and they know they could have just, even just danced for another round and secured the victory, and now you made them lose. There's a lot to go in there, and well, safety is the most important thing. So is your mental health, and there's a lot. Yeah, it's not an easy thing. It's not a simple question, and the more people try to make it that, you can tell they just don't have that much experience.
Have you ever had an issue with a fighter, maybe where you did pull them out of a fight and afterwards they, like you said, they didn't forgive you and they just thought, "I could have went on further"?
No, I'm sure I've had them not forgive me for other stuff, but I've never had that specific situation. I usually tend to err on the side of go fight, because there's a referee there, and there's other eyes on them. So if the referee hasn't come up and said, "Listen, I'm going to stop this fight unless," you know what I mean? Like, so unless they really tell me, "Listen, I'm busted up," and I see in their eyes that they are and they're done, then I'll obviously, I'm not going to go force them into getting more injured when they don't want to do that. But if they're like, "Man, I think my rib's broken, I feel great, I can't wait to go out there," then I'm going to send them out there. And not everybody will agree with that, but that is a warrior culture, and that's kind of what we do.
Yeah. I just want to talk to you about the real elite fighters that you've coached in the past now, because now you've coached great fighters, and I don't mean this as disrespect to other fighters that you've coached, but if I pick the likes of GSP I mentioned before, like George St-Pierre, John Jones, I mean, these are fighters that are legitimately in the conversation to be the greatest fighters that have ever lived really on earth. So I mean, there's phenomenal athletes. It can't just be a physical thing with them. What would you say separates those from other, even world-class athletes, but just a real elite? What would you say separates those fighters?
I think there's a lot of things that separate them. The one that I see, the biggest one that I see, is the work ethic. Those guys will do an extra 3 rounds all the time. They'll run an extra half mile. Other fighters will do what you ask them to do, and the elite always do more. And so that's one big thing. How they approach their fighting career, they're usually pretty smart about it, like who they surround themselves with. Not always, but usually they're pretty smart about it. And they have kind of a mental toughness that the harder their life gets or the harder the fight gets, they always step up. So they're not complaining, that their wife left them and they can't focus, and you know what I mean, or anything like that. Or they'll find a way to win. If they're tired, they're not just going to give up and accept it. They'll look for other options. They're not frozen, and they're tough. So I think there's a lot, just innate pride that they have. There's a lot of factors that go into it, but the work ethic I see is a big one.
And we spoke there about how you deal with fighters within a fight. In terms of after a fight, whether they've won, lost, or drawn, how do you debrief what has happened with a fighter, no matter what the result is? Is it the type of thing where do you talk to them really in the dressing room about what went right or wrong, or do you have to let the emotions settle and maybe revisit it on Monday when you're watching the tape back?
Depends on the fighter. Sometimes I'll give them a week's off, and then we don't mess or talk about the fight, win or lose, until they come back. George was always one. I mean, he always won when I was with him, but he was one that would go back and want to know exactly why something didn't finish the guy. Yeah. Like, he did an arm bar. How did I mess that up? So we would go through the fight. He'd be talking to me, walking back to the dressing room, and we would have to go over the part of the fight that he could have done better, even though it was, he was very dominant throughout. But that's that work ethic that you talk about. Like that, those are the guys.
Of perfectionism as well. That probably
exactly. Right back on it. So that is what I admire about them. One of the many things.
Yeah. You as a coach as well, like I'm sure you're looking for the performance to improve each time, but they are prize fighters. So I guess at a professional level, the most important thing is that to get the win, because obviously they're fighting for contracts, belts, money, basically. So you as a coach, where do you get most satisfaction? Is it all about the win, or like, I mean, in an ideal world, they perform great and they win, but what gives you more satisfaction? Would it be they don't perform well, they don't do what you've asked them to do, but they still get the win? Or would you get more satisfaction if they lost or drew, but there was massive improvements and what you were working on in the gym was bearing fruit on fight night? Like, as a coach, is there a bit of a conflict there? What means more to you, the performance or the result?
Oh, that's a really good question. The old Greg, 10, 15 years ago would have said, the result, because that's what moves you forward. And, so you need to win, like you need to hold on to these championships. You're not always going to have the best performance of your life. You have, like anything, some stale performances where you still win and all that. And I don't know, that's actually a really good question. I don't know what I value more, because what I've come to understand about MMA is it's inspiration based. People watch fights to be inspired, to see courage. Some of them are like you, and you look at details and things like that. But most in the aggregate, most people just don't have time to get that educated on all of it, right? You can be educated at boxing but not know jiu-jitsu, or you can be this amazing jiu-jitsu player and you do a little Muay Thai, but you're not super. It's hard to be educated on all of it. So usually what people like people don't say that like Mayweather they say he's a great fighter, but they don't watch Mayweather fights usually and go, oh, that's a great fight, because he doesn't get hit and he outpoints the guy, right? So that's not a good fight in American culture. Whereas like Gotti and Ward are amazing fights, because basically they're just back and forth. You know what I'm saying? Like one is almost done and then he comes back and the other guy's on, and you get inspired by their courage and their ability to take pain and keep pushing forward and not giving up. And so people call that a great fight. Well, technically Floyd is a much better boxer than either of those guys. but that's not a great fight for people. A great fight is that inspiration. So are you able to inspire people with your courage? And then does that give a great performance? Sure, that's great. Like you said, the ideal is both, but it's kind of that Machiavellian thing. Would you rather be loved or feared, right? Like it's obviously loved and feared is the best of both worlds. So to me, as long as you're staying in the process and trying the best you can try, doing the best you can do, even if you on that day or on that evening, no matter what the result is, I'll be pretty happy.
That's what I like about MMA fans over boxing fans, though, is that losing a fight isn't a big deal in MMA. It is a big deal, but it's nowhere near as big a deal as in boxing. If you lose a fight in boxing, people think people can write you off. But I mean, there's some of the best fighters in MMA have numerous losses. So that's why I was just interested to hear your answer, because the performance, how you perform, is from a fan's perspective, it seems to be a bit more important at times than a result. Look at Nate Diaz. I mean, he has numerous losses, but I mean, he just sells out every building in the world, doesn't he?
Right. No, and I think there's a lot to that, again, because they're watching it for entertainment. And it is a real sport, right? Like, I can't say that my sport isn't a real sport, but there's also a huge entertainment factor to it that the fans bring to it. So, the fans get to dictate what they want to see, and that's what they want to see. So
I just want to talk to you now, Greg, about training camps. So basically just how you structure your training. So more so the mental side of it now than the physical. So would you structure your physical training to almost incorporate a mental side of it? Now, I don't mean to mentally break them. That probably is too extreme. That's SAS stuff. Or maybe that is.
No, I mentally break them. That's all correct. Yeah.
So, but do you actually structure your training to really, really, really push the boundaries of their mental resilience? Are you looking to put them right on that brink because that might be where they have to go on fight night?
It's not just about knowing that they might have to be there. It's the confidence that they'll have going into the fight, knowing that they can perform there. Yeah. So getting people comfortable is, obviously, as you well know, is such a big part of sports psychology, right? Like, you can use, when you step in the cage, sometimes people have anchors. They look at a logo or a post or somebody across the cage from them or whatever, little anchor to get themselves comfortable. So what my deal with that is just try to get them in the red mentally and physically as much as you can, and then keep them calm. That's normal. Everything's fine here. There's no reason to freak out. So if you experience it every week, then when the fight comes, instead of it affecting you mentally, it doesn't pull you out of the process because you've been there every week. So you know what to expect. Hopefully it'll be not as hard as the training, and so you'll really stay relaxed because it's not as bad as the camp. That's the ideal. So usually I push them pretty hard mentally and physically as we get into camp so that they are used to that. They don't panic when they kind of hit that threshold, and they stay calm.
Yeah. And do you oversee every element of the MMA training? So there's so many different elements or different strands to MMA. Your kickboxing, your jiu-jitsu, grappling, whatever it may be. Do you have, I'm sure you probably have specialized coaches in each of those disciplines. So is your job to knit everything together, to almost oversee everything?
100%. So I'm the generalist, meaning that I have to be educated enough I'm not as good as any one of my specialists in their respective arts, but I'm well enough versed in all of them that I can pull it together for somebody and combine them.
Yeah. And you're obviously known for coming up with very good game plans to get wins. So again, I told you before, I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to watching sports. I don't think anyone likes watching sports with me because I look for these finer details. But something I love when I watch fights, particularly boxing, is, I'm sure this applies to MMA as well, is the rhythm of a fight. And I love watching fighters that set a specific rhythm just to break that rhythm. So you know what I mean? Like, they might be throwing out a jab every 3 seconds, and then all of a sudden on that next third second, the jab doesn't come, but the opponent might still react and block, but then maybe they're leaving an opening to their body. That's why I love watching the likes of Alexander Usyk and Lomachenko boxing, because they almost set these rhythms just to break them. When you're setting a game plan, are you looking to get your fighter to develop specific rhythms with the sole purpose of actually breaking that rhythm, and then almost like physically and mentally sort of scrambling their opponent a bit? So are you looking to get them to drill things just so they can break it?
Yeah, that's on the personal growth side. That's a tool in your toolbox that isn't game plan specific. Game plan specific means that you're looking at, so if a fighter has a problem with rhythm, then yeah, you'll be training that. So there's every fighter kind of has a concurrent personal growth plan. And then when it's fight time, we switch over to a game plan. So broken rhythm training, which is what you're talking about, hemiolas, which is where you're basically putting a note in between a note, for lack of a better term, like interrupting people's attack. All of these rhythm-based stuff is tools like a jab or a cross or a hook. There's times to use them and times not to. The only time I would do that fight specific is if it was part of the game plan. In other words, this guy's a sucker for rhythm changes, so that's what we're going to train on. But there's no, and this is the hardest thing about being a coach and trying to communicate it with people that aren't, there's no one way to do it for everybody. There just isn't. Like, and the styles are different, the mentalities are different, the goal can be different. Fighters that move forward, fighters that counter punch and move back, fighters that scramble, you know what I mean? Like, there's so many, it's such a unique situation every time, which it makes it fun. But there's no one like, okay, this is what you do. I mean, even physically wise, you're constantly having to tailor that, because after a week they overtrain or they get an injury. Now you got to train around it. You're constantly, so you can have a general idea of what you're going to do, but it's constantly changing. There's never like, this is what you always do for the fight.
Yeah. You must be at brink of burning out at times. Are you just listening to you talk now? I mean, your head must be just full of MMA 24 hours a day. I mean, do you worry about burning out, or do you have?
I have burned out.
Do you have strategies in place to ensure that it doesn't happen?
Well, don't travel so much and don't be an idiot. So those are my two things to not burn out. So yeah, for about 15 years there, I was 7 days a week. I didn't have many days off. I was always traveling. I was always pushing harder than I needed to. And now I'm a little smarter about it, just a little. I don't travel as much. I delegate out. Other that are better than me help out. But yeah, I burned out hard. I was a pretty worthless coach there for a little while, where I just hit the wall. Lost a lot, rightly so, lost a lot of good fighters. They had to move on to find coaches that were a little more involved, because I was just cooked. And some of them rode with me, and so I still work with them. But yeah, I've hit the burnout as hard as you can be burned out. That's for sure.
How did that look in practice then, when you're saying you hit a wall and you fell out with some fighters? Were you just very irritable and you just weren't on your game, or how did that actually
game? I wasn't calling the right game plans. I wasn't doing the right thing. I was just apathetic. I should have just backed all the way out at that point, but I didn't want to let people down. But then I was letting people, you know what I mean? It's just, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed sometimes, but it was an important process for me to go through. I definitely came out of the other side of it stronger than I went into it. So, and I understood a lot more. I'm a slow learner, but eventually it hammers in here.
As a coach as well, actually, can you learn from coaches in other sports, or can you even learn from different art forms? This is a really weird one, but I heard a boxing coach talking once about how he listens to music and he feels like he can almost learn from musicians, because it's still an art form. I can't remember the specifics of how he linked it, but I just thought it was interesting that he views boxing as an art form, and he can learn from different artists in different art forms. Can you learn as an MMA coach from other sports or even different art forms?
Well, as you get to a point where you can only learn that. There's a great mathematician named Kurt Gödel who basically showed that there's even logic that can't explain everything. There's things that you need to reach out of your paradigm or out of your system to pull in outside information to learn things that you're not going to learn. Music is fighting. It's the same. It's rhythm based. It is jazz. I just made friends with Denzel Curry, who's one of the most amazing rappers in the world. And that's all we talk about. Combat and music relate and don't relate. And what are the similarities? What can I learn from them? But yeah, painting, any art form, your boxing is correct. And mathematicians, nonlinear dynamics, there's so many places you can go to learn about fighting that has nothing to do with fighting, because there's these underlying kind of ubiquitous strategic principles or principles of art and creativity. And if you can find those, then you can translate them back. That's the real trick, though, is finding them, mining them, finding them, and then being able to translate them back into what you do.
Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it, with MMA? Like, you know so much about MMA, but there's just so much that you won't know, because there's just so much that, like, nobody can know everything about MMA. There's so many different strands. How long do you think you will do it? Will you do this as long as you're physically able to?
Yeah, I think so. I'm still having a lot of fun with it, and still making new friends, and still having fun. So yeah, as long as I'm still having a good time and fun with it, yeah, I'm gonna keep it up. As long as I still enjoy the process and I feel like I'm improving and learning, I'll stay with it.
Good stuff. Just to finish up then, Greg, I have two questions that I ask everybody. So it's your turn today. So the first one
Mhm.
is, if you've got a young athlete in your sport, so there's a young guy taking up MMA, let's just say he's turning pro, so he's decent amateur, he's turning professional. What advice would you give him, not from a physical, technical, or tactical standpoint, but from a mental perspective? What advice would you give a young fighter?
My advice for young fighters is always the same, no matter where you are. Be ready for a ton of disappointment. That doesn't mean your losses are disappointment. That means that your opponent doesn't make weight and your fight falls out.
Yeah.
That means that you don't fight for 6 months because two fighters fell out. If you can deal with real high level disappointment, then this sport is for you.
Yeah.
If you can't deal with, oh, you did everything right, you're ready to go, and you twist your ankle right before you go out in the fight. It's such a brutal sport in that it's, so many things can happen, so many times you're going to be disappointed. And if you're okay with that, then it's the sport for you.
Yeah. So the final question then, just to finish off, is what athlete do you admire most for their mindset? And that doesn't have to be an MMA fighter, that can be from any sport, it can be from any era, dead or alive. What athlete's mindset would you say you admire the most, and also why?
There's no doubt Muhammad Ali. I mean, obviously, just time after time going against these unbeatable people and having the press tell him and everybody in his life tell him that there's no way he can beat this guy. It's awful, all this pressure, the political stances that he took that cost him everything, and him still staying in the process back to boxing, changing his style after he couldn't dance like he could anymore. Just so many reasons to really respect what that guy was about. There's no doubt that's him.
Brilliant stuff. Great way to end it as well. Thanks very much for coming to the podcast, Greg. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Anytime you want me on, I'm here.
Massive thanks to Greg Jackson for coming on to the podcast for this episode, and also to those at Jackson Wink MMA Academy in Albuquerque for helping set this up as well, because Greg is somebody that I wanted to have on the podcast for a very long time, because as I mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast, I've been a massive fan of so many of his fighters for such a long time. I've lost count of the amount of times I've stayed up until all hours in the night to watch Greg's fighters compete in UFC pay-per-view cards and fight nights. And I've always just been in awe of their ability and their skill. And I've always loved watching Greg's instructions in between rounds as well. So to have the opportunity to actually get to speak to Greg about the role that he has played and continues to play as well in their careers is something that I'm genuinely very, very grateful for. So again, massive thanks to Greg and to those at Jackson Wink for helping set this up. And hopefully you enjoyed it as well. And if you did, you might want to like the video and subscribe to this channel as well, because then any future video that gets uploaded onto this channel, you'll get a notification and you'll be able to check it out straight away as well. So you'll also see this podcast page on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram if you're interested in following it as well. This is the 31st episode, so I have 30 previous episodes with a variety of different athletes from as many different sports as I could possibly cover as well, and there'll be more to come as well. So again, you might want to subscribe to the YouTube channel and you'll get a notification anytime a new episode drops. So thanks very much for watching, and hopefully you'll check out the next one as well.